we're going to move on to national objectives, and that was one of the items that was brought up in the introduction section. Somebody wanted to know more about national objectives and eligibility. How do you make a project eligible or determine whether a project is eligible? So Chris indicated in the prior session about a little trick that we use, or gimmick, and this was passed along to me by Carol Norris. She was a trainer for many, many years on the CDBG program, and at one of the training sessions I went to, she talked about a coin, and she said, any time that you are considering an activity to determine whether you can fund that activity, take out a coin. And on that coin, it's two-sided, so the head side is whether an activity is eligible. And of course, if any of you have ever gone into the IDIS manual, the IDIS manual has a list of all the eligible activities, right? Okay. In addition, she said, the tail side is your national objectives. So in order for an activity in order for you to be able to fund an activity, you better make sure that both sides of that coin have been met. It's an eligible activity and it meets one of the national objectives. Failure to do that means that that activity is not eligible, okay? So we have 3 national objectives that are found under 24 CFR Part 570-208. Those 3 national objectives can further be broken down into 208 parentheses A as benefiting low and moderate income persons. 208B is a prevention or an elimination of slums and blight. And 208C is meeting an urgent need, okay? And we'll go through all 3 of these national objectives in the next 25 slides or so. Again, you must meet one of these national objectives for an activity to be eligible. And note that when we talk about what the most appropriate national objective is, we're always going to look at the national objective that's going to create the least amount of work for us, because there are activities that will qualify under more than one. And always look at that. Reduce the amount of paperwork, reduce the amount of time that is required not only by you but possibly a subrecipient in documenting eligibility, okay? 70% of your grant, of your annual grant, a minimum of 70% must be spent to benefit low and moderate income persons or households. Minimum 70%, okay? And so when you are determining what types of activities you're going to fund, keep that in mind, because every once in a while we'll see a grantee that is funding a slum blight type of activity and it's 40% of their annual grant amount. And there are ways to do that, and we'll talk about that in one of the upcoming slides. Okay? So we have the 3 national objectives on top, and we have categories under each national objective. So when we look at the low mod, we have 4 separate categories. We have area benefit, limited clientele, housing, and jobs. Under slum blight, we have area basis, spot basis, and urban renewal. And urgent need, we don't have any, okay? And we're actually going to go in and talk about each one of those in more detail. Note that the low mod national objective is called the primary national objective. And the reason for that is that, again, the majority of your funds, minimum 70% of your funds are used under that particular category. And in many cases, I work with many grantees that 100% of their money is actually under that national objective, okay? Therefore, primary national objective. And it is the most common of all of them, okay? So the first category that we're going to discuss is going to be area benefit. And we should be able to get through this just before lunch. Now, area benefit, we have activities. In order to qualify as an area benefit, the activity must benefit all of the residents of, and write this down, the service area. Very important, because what we're doing under the low mod area benefit is we're going to establish what the service area for that particular activity is, okay? And so when we talk about an activity that benefits all of the residents of that service area, we're talking about parks, we're talking about street improvements, a community center that serves the residents of that service area, okay? You must determine the service area, and I'm going to give you 5 factors. And these 5 factors are defined in more detail in the CDBG manual that's in your flash drive. But I think by giving you what they are, it's going to be pretty straightforward, pretty common sense. So the 5 factors that you're looking at when determining your service area is the nature of the activity. Okay? So we're going to do a park. That's the nature of the activity. The location of the activity, where it's physically located. Access issues. And when we talk about access issues, quite often it could be a highway. Okay? A highway could divide a city. Even though as a bird flies, it's 500 yards, but to access that point from the other point, it may require you to drive a mile, okay? So we talk about, access, barriers that make the access a little more difficult. Availability of comparable. And so when we're talking about a park, we're looking at where are the other parks located, okay? So when we're determining service area, we have to know where all the other comparable uses are. And then we talk about boundaries. Boundaries could be established boundaries. And the most common one that I see all the time, or the two that I see, school districts have boundaries, right? So that could be an established service area where you say, well, it's a boundary because all of our students for that particular school live here. It's an established boundary, and it can't be anybody outside of that. Fire districts, right? They have boundaries. Fire Station 1 serves this area. Fire Station 2 serves that area, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we consider as boundaries. So again, the 5 are nature, location, access, availability of comparable, and boundaries. Now, we talked about that the area, yes?
So what you're saying is, no matter if you can use any type of boundary you want, I could use census tracts, I could use whatever, but you don't define the boundary yourself. You have to use pre-existing.
Not necessarily. No, not at all.
So you can't define yourself as long as you can defend it ethically as that.
Bingo. Why? You have to have some rationale, okay? And we're going to kind of go through an exercise in the city of Rivertown. But if you use those factors, we're doing basketball courts. Well, where are all the other basketball courts located? And so the term I use, if I was standing here, which basketball court would I go to? Then I'm going to be in that service area. So we talked about that it must benefit all the residents of the service area. It also must be primarily residential. Okay? Anytime we talk about LMA, low mod area, primarily residential. In a case where even the city is greater than 51% low mod, you must still go through the exercise of determining a service area. Because if you're doing a street improvement, the service area is not the city. The service area is actually the people that are going to benefit from that street improvement. Correct? Okay. So sometimes, I hear that, well, we're 58% low mod, so I can just pretty much do everything. And no, not necessarily, okay? But if you had a community center, and it's only one community center in the entire city, then you can use that 54% LMA because your entire city is LMA, okay? Note that if you are, and Chris will go into more details about neighborhood revitalization strategy areas. So if you have an area that's designated as neighborhood revitalization strategy area, you have an additional benefit under the jobs creation factor, and that is, or category, and that is that it's the only time that you can use jobs under an LMA, okay? And again, Chris will go into more details on that. I believe it is tomorrow. Okay? So again, the area must be at least 51% low mod, primarily residential. Now, as of July 1st of 2014, we no longer are using the census data or the Census Bureau to obtain and utilize for determining our low mod numbers, populations, in the specific census tract block groups. Does everybody know what a census tract and block group is? Okay, so that's what we use to determine whether a specific block group is primarily low and moderate income, right? Now, since July 1st, 2014, we use what is called the ACS, American Community Survey data. And that is used to determine whether the numbers corresponding to that particular block group. So it's going to give us a universal number. The universal number is the total population within that block group. Then it's going to give us the low mod population, and then it'll give us a percentage, okay? So that's what we use. And note that this particular CPD note is 1411, okay? It's a great guide for you, and you might want to get in the habit. Do you all, have you all been registered on listserv? So on HUD Resource Exchange, you can go in and register for listserv, and it has a list of various categories, okay, in which you can get emails, information as it is distributed by HUD. One of which should be, you should all be registered to get CPD notices. And so this is an example of a CPD notice. This is 14-11 that talks about the American Community Survey and the special tabulation, because this is generated through a special tabulation that HUD pays for to be able to get it down to the block group level, okay? Okay. Certain entitlement grantees are considered exception communities. Do we have any exception communities present? Wow, we've got quite a few. So what's your number? 44.66. Back there, we have some hands. 42. 43. Gentleman there?
I think ours is around 42.
42. Okay. The rest of you are going to be jealous. So you know how you have a 51% number? That in order for an activity to be eligible, 51% of the individuals will have to qualify. 42. 42%. So now how is that determined? So I'll try to make it as simple as possible. It's what is called the upper quartile. If we had 100 block groups, okay? And we listed them all in the order of which the highest percentage of low and moderate income people or the highest number of low mod to the lowest, okay? And then you went down 25 rows. You have 100, so it's the upper quartile, 25%. You go down 25 rows, whatever that number is, that percentage is, that's your number. So for those that were 42, that was the number. 43, 44, that was the number, okay? So most likely, these communities have very few areas that are low and moderate income, I'm going to assume, okay? And that's why your number is actually much lower. Also know that you can conduct a survey. And if you are going to conduct a survey of a specific area, the first thing you should do is contact your HUD rep, okay? You want to make sure that you are conducting the survey correctly, and there is guidance under CPD 14-13. Again, it's another CPD bulletin, okay? And it tells you how the methodology that you must use in conducting that particular survey. As an example, sometimes when you are a more rural community, your block group may be huge, okay? But the activity that you're going to be carrying out really only, and if we take this as an example, let's say that this was the block group, but the activity that you carry out is really only going to benefit a group that is this small, okay? You can actually do a survey of that service area to determine if, based on that activity meets the eligibility requirements. In most cases, it's going to be 51%. In a few cases, it'll be 42, 43%. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So you have that option available to you. And it's not used often, but know that it's a tool that you have in your tool belt should you ever need it. Okay? So HUD makes a tool available to you, especially those of you who are responsible for obtaining the low mod percentages for each block group, okay? If you have a GIS department, they may have better tools, but not everybody has one. So what you do is, number one, there's a YouTube on how to use this mapping tool. Now, the tool doesn't map your areas. What it does is, as you go in, okay, in fact, you're going to go into the HUD Exchange. After you look at the video, you're going to go to this map application, and you really can't, there's no picture of it here, but if we were to, I'm going to go back a few slides. If we were to look at, let's say that this was the block group right here, that was your map. The map of your city is much larger. You can actually click on a specific area, and it's going to highlight the boundary of the block group. And then it's going to give you information on that block group. So quite often what grantees that don't have a GIS department but have a city map, what they'll do is they'll go to that website, they'll click on a point, and they'll know what the boundaries are. So they'll hand do a, okay, here's a boundary of that block group. It tells them the number of the block group, the percentages, population, all the information about that particular block group, so they can kind of start establishing their map of all of the specific block groups and the data. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now, we are going to do a quick little exercise, okay? And this is just to test you, and this is going to surprise you, by the way, because there are some misconceptions about low mod area, okay? And I'm going to show them to you. And some of you will say, wow, I would have never thought that, okay? exercise is, this is what you need to do, the process you must go through whenever you are making an activity eligible under low mod area. You remember we talked about you must determine your service area. That's the first thing you want to do, okay? So I'm going to give you a description of the city of Rivertown, okay? So this is the map of Rivertown. The city is approximately 1 mile square. 1 mile, 1 mile. So each one of these squares, which is actually a block group, is approximately a 1/4 mile each, okay? Again, each grid represents a census tract block group. The city is divided by a river, okay? So if you recall those 5 factors, we're looking at what? Boundaries, right? Yeah. Correct. So those are things that you want to start looking at. I'm sorry, yeah. So access issues. So we have the river, the region's one major arterial highway running through the city. So this is the arterial highway, and it runs way over here, and it runs way over there, okay? One side of the city has access to the other through one bridge located in the city. The other bridges are on either side of the city 1 mile away. So the next bridge is 1 mile away. The shaded block groups represent block groups that contain over 51% low mod population. So if we look at north of the river, we have one block group that is low mod, and as a result, this whole area north of the river is 40% low mod, okay? On the south side, it contains 5 block groups that are low mod, and overall, we have a 62% low mod population. The city has 2 parks, one here, one there, okay, with identical amenities. So we're looking at availability of comparable. They are comparable, so we have 2 comparable parks, and all the sports fields, playground equipment, everything is the same. The city also runs daycare facilities, okay? These are the daycare facilities throughout the city. That's the scenario. Everybody got it? All right. So here are the questions. The city wants to replace the existing basketball courts at both parks. Can they fund basketball court replacement under low mod area? Yes. And if so, which park? So Park 2 is located inside of a block group that is low mod. Park 2 is located in a block group that is not in a low mod census tract block group. You guys are sharp. What is this? Okay, so somebody want to explain it?
Why you're allowed to use both of them?
Well, are you allowed to use both of them?
Yes, because Park 1 is accessible by the 5 quadrants that are picked on the bottom, and Park 2 is located in an LMI area, so both of them are eligible.
Okay. We have a different opinion over there?
But you're doing citywide, right? You're looking at citywide access.
Are you? So what's the first thing we do? What is our service area?
Yeah, if you're defining the service area south of the river, then it would be considered.
Okay, so what is the service area of Park 1?
If you define it as south of the river, then it would be 62%.
So if I lived right here, which park would I use?
Park 2.
Park 2. Why? Because the only way to get to Park 1, even though it's closer as a bird flies, I'd have to go all the way around. Right? Okay. So if I lived here, I'm going there. If I lived here, I'm still going there. Why am I going there? All the facilities are exactly identical. So, right. Okay, I'd be going there. If I lived here, I'd be going there. So wouldn't the river be a logical access? Exactly. So would it be reasonable? And again, you have to establish, here's kind of how I defined my area, and say, everything here serves that park. Everything north serves that park. That's the service area. So if the service area for Park 1, what is the percentage for the service area for Park 1? What percentage? 62. Is it eligible? What is the service area for Park 2? Is that eligible? No, it is not. This is where sometimes I get this look of, what? I can't? No, misconception. Just because it's located in a block group that is low and moderate income doesn't mean it's eligible. And that's because, again, it's the service area. We define the service area, and that's the first thing we have to do. Once we've defined the service area using those 5 factors, then we determine, okay, I'm adding all of these census tract block groups to determine what my low mod percentage is. And as a result, believe it or not, the one park that is in a low mod block group is not eligible, and the park that is not in a low mod block group is actually eligible. Okay? So don't get these preconceived, not in a low mod block group, before you actually do your analysis. Equal. Okay? Okay. Question 2. The city wants to make repairs to the major arterial highway. Is this eligible under LMA? How many say yes? It's right here. It's on the south side. Okay? Is it eligible? Who says yes? Who says no? Okay. Why do you say no?
Because the service area, who's using the arterial highway, not necessarily the people who live directly there. People all over the place.
Did you guys hear that? What is the service area of a major arterial? It is huge, right? So, okay. City wants to make improvements to all of its daycare facilities. Is this eligible? No? Who said no? Who said no? Why?
It is, all of the daycares are not in a low mod area, and you're servicing, the daycares could be servicing people that are coming into the community to work, so you don't know that so you're still looking at your service area and your clientele. So maybe some of them.
Okay. So this is a trick question. Yes?
Why wouldn't you use limited clientele?
Okay. I probably would use limited clientele, but can we use low mod area? What's the very first thing we check to see if it qualifies as LMA? And number, but even before we consider LMA, is it available to everybody? No, the service is being provided to children. It's not available to everybody. Okay? It's a child care. So as a result, it has to benefit all of the residents in that service area. Okay? And I use that because that's something sometimes we fail to remember. Oh, you know what? It has to be available to everybody. Okay? Yeah. So the next category we did under low mod, we did the area benefit. Now we're going to do low mod clientele, not to be confused with presumed low mod, okay? Although presumed low mod is an element of limited clientele. So these are activities that benefit specific populations. So we're talking seniors, we're talking youth, we're talking disabled. So again, it targets specific groups in which you are now documenting that at minimum 51% of the beneficiaries are low and moderate income people or households. Well, this is families, okay? Now, you'll notice that when we start talking about limited clientele, in fact, this was a conversation right after we finished the area benefit, you will notice that when we talk about limited clientele, suddenly there's a lot more work that's going to be involved. Every time you assist somebody, there's a beneficiary, you are obtaining income documentation or unless they're presumed low mod, at which point you're obtaining documentation to prove that presumption, okay? So when we look at these two categories, note that if you're able to do an activity and it qualifies under both, you always try to go with area benefit because you make it eligible once, and once it's eligible, you're free to implement that activity. Whereas with limited clientele, each individual beneficiary you're going through and qualifying that individual, okay? So that's where earlier I indicated that there are activities that qualify under multiple national objectives or categories. Always choose the one that's going to require the least amount of work, okay? Also note that housing, rehab, and I'll go back one slide, housing and jobs are not part of limited clientele, okay? They fall under either housing or the jobs creation category. There are 4 options that are listed on the slide for meeting limited clientele. The first is 51% of the participants are documented as low and moderate income. So you will have obtained some sort of income documentation. In one of the upcoming slides, we're going to talk about income. But you're going to obtain documentation showing that at least 51% of the individuals who are receiving assistance are low and moderate income. Okay? For some reason, sometimes there is this misconception that 100% of the beneficiaries must be low and moderate income. That's not true, although it is one of the options that's on here. But as long as 51% of them are eligible, it is an eligible activity, okay? Participation limited to LMI only, so that's the second example that I just talked about, where you as a grantee can say, we're going to use our money to assist only families that are low and moderate income, and therefore you as a subrecipient for public service type programs, you will make sure that 100% of all the people who are assisted are low and moderate income. We look at presumed clientele, and there are 8 categories on this list. And they are elderly, severely disabled adults, and notice that adults is underlined, okay? Youth that are disabled are not considered presumed low mod. It has to be adults. And there's an actual definition for severely disabled adults, by the way. We're also looking at homeless persons, illiterate adults, migrant farm workers, abused children, and persons with AIDS or battered spouses. And all of these 8 are groups in which, because of the type of use or activity, they are just automatically presumed. to be low and moderate income. However, that doesn't preclude you, that doesn't indicate that you don't have to get any type of documentation. And we'll use as an example, if we were assisting seniors, okay, which is elderly, okay, if our activity was helping elderly, and that's the presumed category, what am I going to obtain as documentation to show that that individual who received the assistance is a senior? Driver's license, something, driver's license, okay? So now that I have that driver's license, Mrs. Smith, it shows that Mrs. Smith is actually a senior, okay? And therefore is eligible to participate in the program and I can count them as an accomplishment, okay? So, and it applies to any of these where you must obtain documentation that proves their presumption, but that's it. You don't have to ask for any income documentation, okay? So the last one we have here is, because of the nature and location, it is presumed that the individuals are low and moderate income. So if you have a complex, a multifamily complex that is a Section 8 type complex, and as an example, we work with a grantee that has this after-school tutoring program at a complex that is specifically a Section 8 complex. It can be presumed that the children who are being served are low and moderate, their families are low and moderate income. So because of the nature and location, you can make that determination. Yes?
What do you use to identify a homeless person?
That always comes up in every training, by the way. It's a good question. So homeless is probably the most difficult presumed group to document. In some cases, they may be going to some type of a shelter that provides them with a letter. They may be using some other type of service that provides them with some type of document. But this is a situation where I would say 9 out of 10 times that doesn't exist. And so you will use what is called a self-certification. They'll self-certify, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about self-certification when we get into the income documentation slides, okay? This pretty clear to all of you? Okay. So there are also some unique activities, such as the removal of architectural barriers. And I just so happen to have in our parking lot a question that came up that is kind of relevant. Question is City Hall ADA Improvement Project. National objective, proper documentation, pitfalls to avoid. Okay, so when we talk about ADA improvements, that happens to be one of the presumed clientele, severely disabled adults, right? So when we are doing such improvements, we will make it eligible under the LMC, low mod clientele, because of the presumed low mod category of severely disabled adults. Now, the trick becomes how do you report beneficiaries, okay? And even though this isn't a part of what we typically will discuss, know that in IDIS, there is actually a section in the manual that talks about how to obtain the numbers in your community that are disabled. And that's the information you're going to input into IDIS when you report accomplishments, okay? So I hope that that answers the question. But it was ironic that we were going to be discussing it in this slide. So removal of architectural barriers. And it's one of those situations where we can actually do government buildings, okay? It's the only thing that we can actually do at City Hall is do ADA improvements, okay? Or buildings of local general government, you might say. Okay? And then we have micro-enterprise activities. We have other certain types of job training efforts, which Chris is going to discuss in more detail in the economic development portion of the training. So let's move on to housing. Okay. There are, again, two categories that are precluded from qualifying under limited clientele, and that's housing and jobs, because they have their own category, their own separate category. So all housing related activities will be reported under your low mod national objective for housing activities. Typical activities will include housing rehab programs, whether it's multifamily, whether it's single family owner occupied. It can include home buyer type programs, so those are all sample programs. Chris talked under the definition section earlier today about the difference of household income versus family income. Know that any time that you are doing an activity under the housing category, you're doing housing, you're always using household income, okay? Not family income. Everyone in that household is going to benefit from a housing type of activity. So make sure that you obtain that information correctly. Although it is not required, under CDBG, you don't have affordability requirements, whether it's a home buyer type program, a rehab program, but you can incorporate affordability covenants into those types of activities. We know under home they are required, okay? And document, if you are doing multifamily type developments, okay? You must document that anytime you're doing one structure, one unit, that one unit is occupied by a low and moderate income person. If you're doing 2 units, one of the 2 must be occupied by a low and moderate income household. If you're doing more than 3, then 51% of the units must be occupied by a low and moderate income household, okay? So the only exception of the at least 51% is really 2, at which point one of the 2 must be, okay? Pretty clear? Yes?
You said using household income. What if there's a caretaker? Do we consider that income of the caretaker? Their only purpose is for being there as a caretaker.
Does that person live there? Is that their permanent? So what you want to do is, are you using Part 5 or 1040? Okay. So I know Part 5 because I use that all the time. I rarely use 1040. And we'll talk about the two options. Under Part 5, there is a section that tells you what you count and what you don't count as income. Use that as your reference, okay? Yeah. Okay. So under the NRSA, which is Neighborhood Revitalization Strategy area, or Community Development Financial Institution, and Chris will talk about these two tomorrow afternoon. They have unique benefits, okay? So as an example, if we're an NRSA, we've established a neighborhood revitalization strategy area in our city. We can take all of those housing units that we're assisting in that particular area and make it one rehab, okay? At which point 51% of those units must qualify. So normally, if it's not in an NRSA, each individual has to qualify, right? You can't help them if they are not a low and moderate income person or household. Whereas with an NRSA, with a CDFI, you can aggregate all of these, and as long as 51% of the units are occupied by low and moderate income people, you can fund that. Okay? So people who would normally not qualify would actually be able to have their house rehabbed. That's one of the benefits of the NRSA. Okay? Okay, so next national objective we'll look at category is jobs. How many of you actually implement low-mod jobs type activities? A couple of you? Okay, job creation. Okay. So when the recession hit, we saw a lot of communities suddenly start to have interest in using CDBG dollars to implement job creation type programs. And again, Chris, this is part of what Chris is going to go over in the afternoon tomorrow, but it is one of the most complicated programs to run, okay, using CDBG dollars. It really, you need to make sure you know what you're doing if you're going to implement economic development. Because of the requirements. It isn't like I assisted this person today, I obtained their income documentation, and therefore I am done. It's not like I determine that this area is eligible and therefore I am done. Okay? This requires follow-up, and it's not a one-time thing. It takes sometimes months, if not, could take up to a year, and there's been instances where longer, right, to create all of those jobs and to document the jobs are still being created. So again, Chris will go into more details about the economic development module, but know that it is the most, in my opinion, the most difficult activity to run with CDBG dollars. Okay? What types of activities can you implement? You do business loans, commercial rehab, infrastructure to a business. Note that if you are doing, is that the right one? Yeah, that was the right one. If you are doing commercial rehab, exterior only, okay, and you can do code deficiencies, code violations, okay, and that's using commercial rehab. Quite often I'll see somebody implementing that program and they're doing stuff inside, they're doing the parking lots, they're doing landscaping. It is exterior building only. So in order to use this category, the activity must create or retain permanent jobs. Key there is permanent. Okay, they can't be, we're going to hire somebody for 3 months and then that's it. They have to actually be permanent jobs. And 51% of the jobs created or retained must be available to or held by low and moderate income persons. Those are the keys to job creation and retention. These jobs will be calculated on what is called a full-time equivalent basis, or FTEs. Okay? What does that mean? If I had, and this happens quite a bit, when we go out and we help restaurants, that's a very common use of the job creation retention national objective and category, where they don't hire full-time people, right? They're hiring waitresses, they're hiring busboys, dishwashers, and normally it's 20 hours a week, right? So when we talk about full-time equivalent, we're going to take a 40-hour work week, and if there are 2 employees that work 20 hours a week, the combination of those 2 employees is 1 full-time equivalent job. It's not 2, it's 1, because by the time you add their hours, it's 40-hour work week. So if each one is working 10 hours a week, then you need 4 employees to fulfill 1 full-time equivalent job. Okay? Does that all make sense? Okay. For a created job, a minimum of 51% of the jobs must be held by, again, or made available to low and moderate income person. It is the responsibility of the business to document their income. So make sure within your agreement with that business that one of the requirements is they're obtaining income documentation, or they're certifying, they've gone through the process of making sure that those individuals meet the income requirements. There also is a requirement that there's no special skills that would be required of the individual employees, okay? Unless you're going to be providing the necessary training to be able to do that particular task. For the retained category, you're going to document that jobs would be lost but for the fact that CDBG funds are being used. Now, this is more complicated than you think. The proof of burden is on you, okay? Don't just fund this as, well, we're retaining this business because they told us they were going to leave if we didn't give them $100,000. Not going to fly. There has to be some type of documentation and proof that, but for these dollars, they were going to leave. And that's where it's not an easy task to do. I would be on the phone with my HUD rep saying, hey, so there's this article in the newspaper that says that they're going to be leaving. We'd like to approach them to try to have them stay in our city. The documentation is in the newspaper. They don't even know we're approaching them, but we want to. Could we use this money? Okay, I would make sure I'm, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, because it is something that, you have to make sure that you have proper documentation of them leaving. Word of mouth, an email is not going to do it. Okay? Yes?
It says 51% of the jobs created must be available to LMI, but it doesn't say how many jobs need to be created. Is there any limits, guidelines?
Yes, there are. And so right now, more than anything, we're going through the national objective part. So we're just giving you the skeleton or the foundation part that says, here's what's required to use that national objective. So Chris is going to go through the numbers, the public benefit standard. He's going to go through, here's the maximum that you can provide per job being created, and here's the public benefit standard for per job that is created. Okay, and again, he'll go through that tomorrow. But again, this is the foundation that we use to determine whether that activity falls under that national objective. Okay. We went through all of that. So again, if it's going to be retained, you need to show that it's currently held by an LMI person or is expected to turn over in 2 years and be filled by or made available to low and moderate income persons. Okay, that's for retention. Okay, so for jobs to be considered held by, this is the definition. 51% of the actual full-time equivalent jobs must be held by LMI, must document income of LMI persons hired, or have evidence of qualifying presumption. Now, this evidence of qualifying presumption, there's a number of ways of doing that. There's actually a slide that's coming up 2 slides from now that will give you ways of qualifying based on presumption. And it kind of goes into something like this, where we have an area and we'll discuss whether the business or the individual that's requesting the job lives in a specific area of your jurisdiction and what those requirements for that particular block group would be, okay? So that's where we talk about evidence of qualifying presumption. You must have an agreement with that business, and that agreement is going to outline what you are expecting of them. income documentation. You're going to, maybe you provide them with the forms that they need to use to document income, whether it's going to be self-certification or some type of other documentation. But one of the most important elements of that agreement is that it should be outlining the actual jobs that are going to be created. If you are doing a restaurant, as an example, and there are 4 jobs that are going to be created, in that agreement it should outline that one is a waitress, one is a dishwasher, and 2 are busboys. It's outlining it because you have to make sure that those job classifications don't require any special skills. And you're matching it to the jobs that then are being created and reported once they are created, okay? So it's important that your agreement has all of these things outlined within the document, okay? For jobs to be considered available to low and moderate income persons, again, no special skills and training. LMI persons must receive first consideration. So that doesn't mean that you can't hire somebody who's not low and moderate income. It means that you will give first consideration and you will have exhausted all efforts. And if you can't find somebody who is low and moderate income, then you open it up to the rest, okay? You must have a written agreement, again, with the business. That some of these slides start getting a little repetitive, so, okay? For the job presumption, so that was 2 slides ago. Remember I said there's a way that we're going to presume that an individual job is low and moderate income. It may be presumed that a low income or job if the employee resides in a census tract block numbering area with 20% poverty and general distress. So let's assume that this particular block group actually qualifies for that. So it is actually 25% poverty rate and is it's an area of general distress, okay? If you look at the bullet point, this one here, so the first 3 are for employees, the last 2 are for businesses. But you'll notice that this business and this employee one basically say the same thing. One is, if the employee resides in this area, automatically qualifies as a low and moderate income person. So what the employer wants to do is get a copy of their driver's license or something that shows that they live in that particular area, okay? Or if we were to do the business, if the business was located in this location, automatically presumed to be a low and moderate income business. They don't have to document any further, okay? Yeah, absolutely. Other than showing that it's actually located here, okay? Second option is employee resides in the census tract block group numbering area with 30% poverty, and it's in a CBD, a central business district, and general distress. So let's say that this was a central business district, then this is no longer 20%, it's now 30%, okay? And then the last one for employees is if it is in a census tract with 70% LMI. So let's say that this block group was 72% LMI. Somebody who lived here that was seeking employment automatically qualifies, just showing proof of their address, okay? See how this is starting to get a little simple? Now, the key, if you're going to use this, and we use it all the time, where if we're going to do any type of a job creation type activity, we will take the map of that city, that grantee, and we plot all of these down. And then we actually attach it to the agreement. We say, if you have individuals who you're going to hire who fit one of these categories, obtain proof of residency, and you will have satisfied as long as they live in one of those areas. Or Maybe the business already is located in one of those areas, at which point they will have automatically qualified. Okay? So look at these options, okay? Kind of, it's a great tool to have, right? Great option to have. We use it all the time. Low mod income documentation. So here's where we start talking about what are our options. So there used to be 3. Section 8, which is actually Part 5, by the way. Everybody refers to it as Part 5. IRS 1040 long form and census long form. Now, the census long form in the actual regs still exists, but it no longer exists in real life. So when they did the last census, they did not use the long form. All of you should have received a real short census, right? How many people live in your house, head of household, et cetera, et cetera. It's one pager. Whereas before, the Census Bureau used to send out what were called short forms and long forms. The long forms were pages long, right? You had to fill them out. How much actual income, how much this, how many kids go to school, how many, well, that no longer exists. So as a result, we no longer use the long form. You only have 2 options that you can use for income. When you are running an activity, let's say you're running a housing rehab program, you must select one and you stick with that. When you do your policies and procedures, you indicate this is the income determination method that we are using. Okay? And that's what you have to use all the time. You can't, for one applicant, use one, for another applicant, you use the 1040. Has to be consistent. However, you can do your housing rehab with Part 5, and you can do your home buyer with 1040 if you wanted to. You're not prohibited to do that. Okay? It's just within that same activity, you must be consistent. How many of you have one other item of discussion, and that is, how do I determine income? So what you're doing is you are looking at a point in time, and that point in time is that instant in which you are reviewing that application. I'm reviewing it today. What is their income going to be for the next 12 months? Okay? You're not looking at the fact that they were unemployed 3 months ago. You're not looking at, records from the past to determine their income. You may be looking at, most of you will probably implement like a housing rehab program, right? Where you ask for copies of their income taxes, but you're requesting them. Why? Because you want to see if there's anything unique in the background that they may not be, disclosing to you as part of their application as income. And so it could be that they have rental properties, for example. Those are not going to show up in their pay stubs, right? But they will in that income tax return. So you're trying to make sure that you have all that backup information. But when you are determining income, it's from today forward 12 months. If they just started a job this week, and they hadn't worked for 2 years, well, you are now going to take into account that they are working, and you're going to calculate that income out for 12 months. Move on to the slum blight spot basis. Now, this is a little more difficult in that, and limiting, okay? You can use slum blight on a spot basis for activities that eliminate a specific condition of blight, okay? So you can't just say, oh, we've got, this building is slum blight and we're gonna just do all kinds of rehab to it. This is great. Number one, it cannot be in a slum blight area, okay? Number two, your funds must be used to alleviate that condition, okay? that specific condition of blight. So let's say that we had a historic building in our downtown, and the parapet is starting to fall over, okay, into the public right-of-way. It's a health hazard. And we found out that the electrical system was brought in by Thomas Edison, okay? So, yeah, it's time for, that building, we're lucky that it hasn't burned down. So when we look at spot blight, it doesn't then allow us to do the painting on the building. It doesn't, we're going to address the parapet, we're going to address the electrical. That's it. That's in a nutshell, okay? So note that it really does limit you, but at the same time it allows you to do something to a building that may not, under other circumstances, qualify, okay? Slum blight, urban renewal, and again, we're going to skip this slide altogether because none of you are urban renewal, right? Okay. So this doesn't apply to anybody. Okay. So we're looking at typical activities, rehabilitation of facilities, interim assistance. Okay. So the low and moderate income overall benefit requirements, not the same as area benefit. The low mod overall requirements are 70% of your grant allocation, not inclusive of admin. So if you subtract admin and you have $100 of grant money, $70 must be used for low and moderate income households or families, okay? That means that we have 30% that we can use every year, right? There's an exception there. And you notice how Chris and I, we say, here's what the rule is, however, there's an exception. And you'll be hearing that a lot. There are a lot of exceptions. So this is a trick that, I wouldn't say a trick, but a tool that you can use where, let's say that next year you want to spend more than 30% of your grant allocation on commercial rehab. You did a slum blight analysis. You really want to focus your money there next year, but City Council wants to use 40% money for that. And you're like, well, we can only use 30%. You can actually do 40%, okay? However, what the rule basically says is that you can average that 70% over a 1, 2, or 3 year period. That means that if I funded, but I have to note this in my action plan. You'll all notice when you do a certification, have you ever seen a box that says, is this for what year? And then it'll have a blank, but it has 3 spaces, right? And normally you just fill out 1 year. It's that 1 year, right? However, let's say in that situation I said, well, I'm going to go ahead and spend 40% next year. And I'm going to do my certification for 2 years. I'm going to do next year and the following year, because the following year, I'm going to spend $0 on slum blight. So I'm going to average that 40% over a 2-year period, which then makes it what? 20%, right? And I fall under that 30% requirement. So know that you have that as a tool that's available to you if you ever wanted to exceed the 30% for a slum blight type of activity, okay? To look at your low mod overall benefit, you go to your IDIS report, your PR 26, right? And it actually has it outlined. In line number 22 will give you the percentages. If you use a multi-year like we have there, It'll be lines 23 through 26, and I had a question back there. Calculating the low mod income benefit based on actual expenditures when objective is met, okay? Planning and administration expenditures are not included in this calculation. All right? So let's do a real quick calculation here. Total entitlement grant amount, $1 million, less planning and admin, leaves us $800,000. When we multiply by our 70%, $560,000. How much of that is subject to the low mod calculation? $800,000, right? This is what is subject to the calculation, okay? Less low and mod minimum, so equals the amount of slum blight urgent need. That's the maximum we can actually use for slum blight. Okay? Pretty simple calculation. It's really just taking 70% of the amounts, okay? Now, if you have program income, how many of you actually receive program income? Okay? So here's something that sometimes shocks people. And it's important that you note this. You're able to use a percentage of your program income for admin, right? Public services, right? Okay. But here's where it differs. So for admin, let's say we're in the 16-17 program year, right? I'm a July 1st through June 30th grantee. So I'm still in my 16-17 year. And I receive program income today. I can take 20% of that and add it to this year's budget. This year. I increase my budget by 20%. For public service, next year. So I receive $100 today. I increase my admin budget by $20 today, and I'm going to program it in my action plan for next year, those $15. I don't program it for this year. It's next year. And admin for this year, not next year. Okay? Very important. Yeah.
That's a very tricky thing when you because there's a whole nother piece to that, and I'm just dealing with this now with program income, is the fact that you reseed it and you want to plan for next year, but the reality is you have to expend it immediately.
For this year, on admin.
Right.
And you got to
admin.
draw it.
admin.
No, for program too, you still have to draw it as soon as you reseed it. You have to apply it to whatever activity you've got coming up and draw it.
Well, you're drawing it because you draw program income first. Doesn't mean you have to draw it. But it's what you reimburse yourself first with money in hand versus requesting it from the U.S. Treasury.
So you say we don't have to, if we receive program income, it doesn't have to come out immediately with the very next draw you have?
No,
No,
it does.
the very
It
next draw, it
does.
does.
But what you're doing is you're drawing down funds for other activities, and you're saying, well, I have $100 in hand, and my drawdown is $120. So I'm going to take this 100 and I'm going to reimburse myself. I'm still going to put it in IDIS as 120, but because I reported that I had PI, the system knows I have $100 in my hand, okay? And therefore, as I do my draws, once I get to the $100, it knows, okay, now the other 20 are going to come from the U.S. Treasury, okay? Yeah. So, but it doesn't mean, I have to spend them this year. I could generate, $1 million in PI, and I may end up having money, at the end of the year, I still have PI left. And we're going to go through that explanation later in terms of what happens when you have excess PI. It actually has to be sent back to the U.S. Treasury. It goes back to your account, but it goes back to the Treasury, okay? There's a process. So, excluding housing activity expenditures, number of units occupied. So this is our calculation that we did for 51%. So if we had Total of 6 units in the structure, and 4 of them were low mod. That's 67% of the units. If we're prorating on a $300,000 rehab, then we can spend 20% of our funds on that particular rehab. And this is just prorating a rehab type project, a multifamily rehab project, okay? Choosing the right national objective, and I've indicated this a few times now, make sure that you choose the national objective that requires the least amount of work, not only from you, but from your subrecipients. General LMI is the easiest. Low mod jobs considered to be the most difficult, and we discussed both of those points. Consider the LMI targeting requirements, which is 70%. Okay, make sure you're complying with that. And then last, putting it all together. And all of you should have gotten this graphic. It's a handout. So we really talked about point number 2, okay, the yellow one. And we're going to be building on this. And the idea, we won't talk about it at this point, but Thursday, Chris, the very last session, is going to summarize that whole process for you. Okay?